Hello and welcome everybody to the latest in our lockdown live stream series from Glasgow Loves EU. And this evening we're really pleased to welcome Claire Taylor of the Scottish Farmer magazine to talk about farming, agriculture, Brexit, trade deals and much more. We've got Bernd helping on technical aspects this evening, and we've got Jenny who's going to be checking for your social media questions. So if you've got any questions, please send them in and we'll try and ask Claire those questions. So tomorrow is the anniversary of our lockdown live streams, would you believe? So 15th of June last year, we started these. And who would think that we were still surrounded by COVID really in, a whole year later. But and really we're touching on farming this evening. So it's such an important area for the Scottish economy and close to so many people's hearts as well. And farmers have been like one of the unrecognised really key workers, keeping us all fed during lockdown and things like that. So it's really important that we're talking about this evening. And we think it might be quite timely because we've heard rumours that the Australian deal is maybe being signed imminently. So we'll be talking about that with Claire, hopefully. So 10 months ago, you spoke to us and you were telling us about the agricultural bills that were going through like the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament. Could you give us like what were the latest updates on how those were going, Claire?
So trying to think back to it when we last spoke about them, so the bills were still in progress at that stage, and with the UK and Scotland, there's two different bills going through the process, because obviously with leaving the EU and leaving the Common Agricultural Policy, powers are devolved to the different administrations. So in the UK, they passed their agricultural bill in November last year, and they're very much looking to, over the next 7 years, so between 2021 and 2027, they're looking to move fully away from direct subsidy support for farmers, and they're moving towards a system called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and that is going to be, farmers are going to be signing up for this towards the end of the year, and it's going to be fully in progress from 2024, and it's going to be farmers are awarded for environmental delivery, so things like protecting and enhancing our soils, our water courses, improving our natural environment, so supporting wildlife and pollinating populations. And when we spoke about this before, there's a huge concern around the UK agricultural bill because we were worried that food production wasn't really at its heart, at its core. And there have been things put into the bill since then to protect that, but it's still very much focused on environmental delivery. So in Scotland, the Scottish bill was passed in October, but at this stage, we're looking to, with the Common Agricultural Policy, we're looking to really roll over and continue the level of support until 2024. And this is the idea of giving farmers that stability to continue knowing what money's coming in for the next few years, and from 2024 there'll be a new system of support. We don't quite yet know what that support is going to look like, not as far as we do as part of the UK bill. What did happen was the previous Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Farming, Fergus Ewing, who's recently been replaced by Mary Goujon, MSP. So he actually initiated 5 farmer-led groups who were experts from different sectors in farming. So this included like your arable sector, your pig sector, dairy, your suckler beef group, and also an hill and upland farming and crofting group. So 5 different areas who are all to come up with ideas of how farmers could really look to streamline and change their practices to be more environmentally friendly, and obviously to fit in with the Scottish Government's ambitious climate change goals. And advice was collated and given to the Scottish Government, and before the election there was a wee bit of controversy because we hadn't heard what happened to this advice and what was then going to be put into what are potentially going to be pilot schemes for how future support will be administered in Scotland. So with the new government in place now, and they announced their first 100 days of government, we're hoping to see these suggestions from the 5 farmer-led groups being put into action, and these pilot groups will be coming forward. And this could hopefully form future policy longer term for Scotland, because right now, Scotland is very much at their heart. They want to maintain food production, but also, like in the UK, work very much to rewarding farmers for working with the environment. And we talked about it in this time, 10 months ago, we talked about the fact that as part of the EU and under the Common Agricultural Policy, farmers are very much rewarded for owning land. And it was a very antiquated practice. This is part of the reason a lot of farmers actually did vote to leave the EU, was because they wanted to move to a more productive system that would reward farmers for being more proactive and things like working with the environment. So we're hoping to have a little bit more detail around what this will look like in terms of future support in the next couple of months. Oh, I've lost you, Jenny.
Unmute. Sorry. Gosh. Right. Sorry about that. So I was just going to say, so do you know what the 5 farmer-led groups will come forward to ask, or?
Well, they've already submitted their proposals, and this is very much was given the backing of the Cabinet Secretary at the time, Fergus Ewing, and what we were really, at this point, they were working with the civil servants to deliver what these pilot groups would look like. So some of the suggestions, for example, would have been like changing nutrition and how that would impact on reducing methane production. Some things could be looking at investment in renewable energy as well, and be providing support for farmers to invest in that side of things. It could be things, other things like investing in different innovations to have more precision agriculture. So you're looking at reducing fertilizer use as well, and that kind of impact on the environment. So these are different suggestions from the different groups, but they all very much come from that same sort of goal. Although it's 5 groups, they're all very much wanting to work together to really solve or use farmers at the sort of front end to deliver on climate change goals.
Really modernise practice and things like that. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I saw Marie Goujon had submitted a letter to Liz Truss. It was about a month ago, I think, asking, or no, maybe mid-May, asking questions. So maybe Jenny could share that just to show people what she was asking about the trade deals and things. So that's quite interesting, all about the latest things on these agriculture bills. And how has Brexit been affecting farmers, the practicalities in the recent months?
Well, the big thing when we all last spoke was we were really concerned about whether or not we'd have a deal. So at that point, I'm sure I shared with you some of the concerns around what that would mean for farming. And of course, we all know in the 11th hour, we got a deal for Brexit. However, it wasn't a deal that has ended up being obviously what we all expected would be a good deal from Brexit. I mean, we've gone from being a member state of the EU to being a third country. So this means our exports are now, they're treated as third country exports. So we've seen a huge increase in the amount of paperwork at our borders. So we've had animal health certificates, we've had sanitary and phytosanitary checks that have to be taken in, all things that before we obviously had equivalents across the EU. So it's caused huge disruption at the border. And at the time, the UK government, they sort of coined it as teething problems. These are very much developed into fundamental flaws in the system. These weren't just teething problems. And a lot of your export businesses are still having challenges here. Even though I don't really cover the sort of fishing sector too much of my work, we'll have all seen the reports about the lorries with fish rotting on the border. You know, a lot of these sort of just-in-time supply chains, a lot of the fish that we're exporting over to Europe, I mean, it has to get there within, 12 hours. But if they're being held up on the border, if they don't have the right paperwork, and there wasn't really a joint up communications between the officials in the EU and those here in the UK as well. So that was a problem. So people were turning away certificates, and they were actually, because it was paper based, I mean, this wasn't a digitized system. It was a very archaic trading system. So you were having to park up your lorries and wait for 24 hours for it to be delivered the next day. So people were consigning, lorries full of seafood just to landfill. I think at one point it was reported that the seafood sector was losing about £1 million a day due to these checks. So, it's absolutely crazy. And then in the red meat sector as well, you had huge problems. I think we were down by about 50% in exports as well. And obviously, we've got to be realistic. It was compounded by COVID as well. And obviously with delays with hospitality, there's not as much product moving. So you can imagine this is only going to get worse as we move out of lockdown. There's going to be more goods moving across the country as well, and these supply chains are being impacted by lots of things in terms of shortages of lorry drivers as well. So it has been a sort of ongoing impact. And at this stage as well, we're only seeing these checks at the border on exports into the EU. So there's been a grace period for checks on imports, and that's been further extended. That was actually in April time. They extended the animal health certificates, I think it's into October this year, and the sanitary checks until January next year. So you could imagine when suddenly we're faced with both our import and export checks taking place in the months to come, there's going to be even greater disruptions. There's going to be more food that isn't getting across the border, and so it is hugely concerning, hugely concerning.
Yeah. And did I hear that they were banning live exports from the UK? Has that happened yet? Do you know? Or?
Yeah, so I mean, so this is something to give you a little bit of a timeline on this. So since 2018, Michael Gove, he'd put the idea out there to look at banning live exports to slaughter, and it's something that a lot of animal welfare groups have called for, and the public do seem quite behind the idea of, obviously, you know, we want to ideally slaughter animals as close to the point of production as possible. So, and obviously with leaving the EU, we have an opportunity to adjust and change our animal welfare standards. And just at the moment, this is being looked at in a bill just now. And I think when the proposals came out earlier in the year, they were looking at things like adjusting the time for slaughter, and they were looking at in terms of the temperature that animals are traveling, and they were looking at like the height room for animals too. All these things obviously do sound very positive, but just to give you the sort of farming perspective and why this is a real concern is, if we look at Scotland in particular and our island communities, the likes of Orkney, they lost their abattoir in January 2018, so they have to export all of their livestock off the island to Aberdeen and onwards to be slaughtered. I mean, that's a 10-hour journey. So, and if you look at the journey between Dover and Calais, and you know, it's so much shorter in comparison. So yes, that this bill is looking at only being, you know, it's very much said there'll be you know, I don't know quite know what the words is, but within that there would be Scotland should be protected, our island should be protected. But at what point does this stop? If the public are behind stopping a ban on exports, you know, to a much closer destination with 10 hours to the likes of Orkney and Aberdeen, it's a real concern this could end up shutting off some of our island communities. And really, the big thing the government should be focusing on here is actually increasing the number of abattoirs in the country. I mean, I think it's something like, I think we've gone down to around 90 red meat abattoirs across the UK. We used to have only a few years, 2-3 years ago, we had around 250. You know, animals are having to travel further to slaughter. Really, we should be looking at bringing more of these, or exploring things like your mobile abattoirs as well, so we can increase welfare in that respect too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So thank you about that. And these lorries, I know this is something I keep wondering about, but the lorries don't have water for the animals. Is that right?
So the animals,
like the transport lorries, do they have water for the animals in them? I know.
Well, the ones so the last one. So I actually followed a route from the Orkney to Aberdeen route that I went on. I actually followed the containers, and they all did have water in them for all the animals during transit. And I know that at the moment it's 8 hours that animals are able to travel for, and then they'll be stopped and they'll be rested, and they'll be watered and fed as well. So those regulations are in place, and we do need to remember here that obviously this applies across the EU and the UK as well. Remembering this as well, so these regulations, they're very tight on transport too.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we've just had in the news about, did you get a chance to find out more about the sausage wars? It's like to do with the Northern Ireland situation and the what's going on there. Can you explain it for us?
So there's no health certificates for your sausages or your mince, and there's been a sort of temporary grace period for these products up until July, so that they have been able to transfer to the EU. So obviously now that grace period is coming to an end, and the UK would very much like to seek equivalence, so that the EU would recognise that, you know, we have the same standards here as they have within the EU, so to allow these sausages to continue to be exported. Of course, on the other hand, the EU would like us to compromise and to accept some of the regulations as part of the EU in terms of sort of environmental, plant and animal food safety regulations, and this is causing a standoff, which is thus the sausage war, and at the moment it does look like the EU are saying that if we were to sort of bilaterally pass an extension on this, then they would take us to court over this. They take legal action, and in a worst case scenario too, we could look to face quotas and tariffs and products, which would add to a huge heap of problems that I've already sort of mentioned as well if this were to happen. And obviously the G Summit talks that took place this week as well, I don't think the sausage war has really been solved at this stage.
Yeah. Oh, crazy. Okay, thank you. Jenny, have any questions come in from social media?
Well, we've had a question about protests. Do you think that the farmers will be organising any protests or joining any protests anytime soon? Has it got to that point?
I think, there's been a number of protests over the last year, even during the pandemic. I've quite often Save British Farming, the group, they've actually marched on Westminster a few times with tractors during the last year. They were very active. I mean, last year when we spoke about some of the sort of food standards being put into the UK Ag Bill and the Trade Bill, and I think if it got to that sort of crux point in trade negotiations where it was looking like, farming was being used as a pawn to sort of quicken these trade deals, I do think farmers would take to the streets over this. I think farmers are deeply concerned, because even those farmers that, voted for Brexit, I mean, why did they vote for Brexit? I mentioned earlier about moving away from the sort of antiquated common agricultural policy, but they were sort of sold this idea of, competing on a global stage with increased animal welfare standards and to really be a global leader. And, they want free trade, but they don't want it to be free for all trade. And if it comes to the point that this is what's going to happen, I mean, farmers over here will completely be undermined. And I absolutely think they'll be up in arms. And already you're seeing, members of the National Farming Unions really butting heads with the UK government over this. And they've been very vocal in the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. So do you think they're turning against Brexit, or the mood's turning, or?
Well, it's difficult to know, and I think we said this again, in Scotland, our views on Brexit are slightly different than those south of the border, but I think a lot of it, I mean, one of the reasons the government are so keen to, have a strike a trade deal with Australia, and to really, they want to show that there's a positive to come out of these Brexit promises that they sold to farmers and to the public in general. And if they don't strike trade deals soon, then people are going to say, well, what was the point of Brexit? We wanted to have this global trade agenda, but you're not achieving it, which is why, compromising on food and farming, that is going to be their sort of quickener to get these deals done, unfortunately. So I think if farmers are to be undercut in this, I would be quite surprised if they were going to support Brexit in a situation like that.
Yeah, because it sounded a bit like Scotch whisky industry was quite happy with the deal, but I guess Scotch whisky comes from Scotland. They've not really got a competitor as such in Australia, whereas the farm. Sorry,
I was just going to say, I think the tariffs are around 5% for Scotch whisky exports to Australia. So of course, a lot of your Scotch whisky companies would be very happy to remove that tariff. So I think, and I have noticed, I saw they had the UK government minister up recently in Scotland at one of our whisky distilleries, and they were sort of very much trying to say, look, it's going to be such a good thing for Scotch whisky, almost to the point that they were hiding the fact that, not hiding, but they were sort of saying, well, here's your sort of softener of the deal, yet we're going to undercut in other areas. So I think they're sort of saying, because it is our biggest export, Scotch whisky, and that's something the government will keep harping back to.
Yeah. So the EU was like 50% of our exports. Australia was just over 1%. That's just in general exports. But obviously this trade deal, well, how are farmers going to cope if it is like no tariffs, no quotas, like it might be? What do you think?
Yeah, so with Australia, I mean, I said it before, I mean, they're really rushing through a deal with Australia, and you said right at the start of the call, Jenny, it's seeming like it's going to be pretty imminent. And, I was hearing, even over the weekend, we saw our Secretary of State, Alistair Jack, was saying, he was sort of revealed that we're getting right to the crux of the deal now, and we're about to really sign on the dotted line. And, they're very keen to sort of hurry a deal through on this, but because the EU is also looking at a deal with Australia, and they want to obviously get there first. But what we've got to remember with Australia, it might not sort of send up the same red flags as the United States deal might have done, maybe slightly in terms of your kind of welfare standards. However, like there are still huge red flags when it comes to if we compare the sort of, you know, the scale of production in Australia. You're talking farms where, you know, tens of thousands head of cattle compared to your average farmer here with 100 or so. I mean, the kind of economies of scale that you're competing on, it just sort of, it hits Scottish producers out of the park entirely. And I think, I mean, in terms of, you know, your sort of hormone injected beef, I mean, there's been concerns of that in the media. What I would say is, you know, around 40% of Australian cattle use a hormone implant. I mean, this is within UK legislation. We wouldn't be able to import hormone beef. So that isn't the concern, but there's a huge amount of other cattle that aren't using hormones. And if Australia were able to get a deal with the UK, which was tariff-free, quota-free, I mean, you could bet you they would upscale production in those areas to meet those regulations and standards that we had too. And I think, I mean, the real concern here as well is we talked earlier about the fact that farmers are under increasing pressure with, you know, the UK Ag Bill. We talked about the fact they're going to have to be producing food which is really environmentally friendly. So everything is geared towards our carbon footprint. I mean, that is the future vision of this industry. Yet, on the same hand, they're wanting to fly in produce from halfway around the world. It just is totally undermining farmers in that respect. So what you could, I mean, I can sort of envisage a situation happening where food producers over here, you know, are put out of business because, you know, they can't make a living. So they're just going to fill that gap with imports, which again, none of this adds up when it comes to the sort of heavy carbon tag that's going to be attached to this deal as well. But and something else that I know not too many people have sort of drawn parallels with, and, you know, Australia right now is undergoing a mouse plague. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous, some of the scenes from the eastern parts of the country, New South Wales. I've spoken to farmers over there. I mean, then this is an impact of climate change. They've had years of bushfires and droughts, and, you know, these bushfires have they've removed a lot of the natural predators. So mouse have just absolutely exploded in numbers, and it is devastating parts of agriculture across the country as well. And it's a real sign for how climate change is really impacting in Australia. And, you know, and recently, I'm sure they were saying, I think it was last November, they were really sort of getting close to in breach of the Paris Agreement for the 1.5 degrees. I mean, they're really close to the edge on that. So we've just got to remember is that we've got to sort of draw that sort of parallel from Australia, what's happening over there to their farmers, and with climate change, it's sort of made us realise how important it is, if possible, to increase domestic production over here and to be as sustainable as possible. And the best way to do that is, well, in my opinion, it's really addressing things like seasonality and getting people to be more in tune to what we're eating, and not to sort of create this demand for imports all year round. And because at the end of the day, you know, our lambs are born in April, you know, our main sort of slaughter point is in September. So there's often a sort of gap, and that is often being filled by your New Zealand imports, and much less so, but your Australian imports. So it's about sort of, you know, sort of, I think as consumers, we have a real responsibility here to sort of think about what we're eating too, so we're not creating this absolute demand for imported food.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, because you were saying, I think it was it England? A lot of our lambs exported to England, so.
Oh, a huge amount of it is. I mean, we don't eat enough lamb here in Scotland. You know, why aren't we sharing, you know, the real benefits of something that's on our doorstep? You know, we've got amazing grass that is converted into really nutrient-dense protein, yet we're exporting a lot of it to England and Wales as well. So, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done here to promoting our very own fantastic produce before we start constantly promoting the benefits of food from abroad.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thank you about that. And so what about we had sort of predicted there might be like shortages of workers, and you were touching on that last time. Has there been any more news on that?
Yeah, so when we spoke last time, one of the biggest concerns was around the sort of soft fruit season, which runs between sort of April and October. And a lot of that was impacted by COVID. You know, people weren't getting over on planes as well. And there was a sort of a national call out was put out to get a sort of national workforce. You know, people were furloughed, and so everyone got very excited, and you thought we were going to suddenly have this, you know, huge Indigenous workforce working within the soft fruit industry. We didn't quite materialise that way. I think the official figures were around 11% of the workers were actually from a sort of domestic workforce. So this year, we're still struggling to recruit members, but it's not quite as bad as it was last year, but there are still real concerns. The government's seasonal agricultural worker scheme, before, I think when we talked about this, it was 10,000 was the limit, and this is basically to create a quota to bring in people from out with the EU, because we're very much finding that a lot of Europeans aren't wanting to come to Scotland or to the UK to pick fruit, because they can do so within Europe on their sort of next door neighbours for a lot of sort of better money in terms of the euro and the pound as well. So we're looking out with Europe. So this is sort of not even just a Brexit problem. So they've actually increased now. So we're getting people from outside Europe, up to 30,000 are able to come in and sort of fill some of these shortages. But there are still concerns around that and the people that are actually operating the scheme. There's only a couple of different companies, so there are concerns there. But and this year, instead of putting out this sort of national call for your furloughed workers, I think it's very much being dealt with the Department for Working Pensions, so that people are directly going to those who signed up for unemployment, and that's how they're working it. But one of the real concerns, and I'd mentioned this to Jenny earlier this week, is that the Royal Haulage Association called me last week to say that we're having real problems with HGV drivers. And if you think about our food supply network, I mean, there's lorries now being parked up across the UK that aren't getting deliveries in time, and they're really predicting that there could be food shortages by the autumn. So I think it's something like 15,000 HGV lorries were lost from January the 1st when Brexit came into place, because at that point HGV drivers, they weren't on the UK immigration shortage occupation list, so they weren't coming in, and a lot of foreign workers do fill these roles too. So I think often the sort of logistics side of our food supply chain is often taken for granted as well. So there's concerns in that area too. And then, and the UK government, the Home Office response to that is, we need to train Indigenous workforce, but, it doesn't really solve the immediate problem that we're going to have food shortages imminently. So it's, there are sort of money being put into training up apprentices and to bringing on people, but, there's immediate action needed. And that immediate action is that we need to add HGV drivers to the shortage occupation list. Mm-hmm. Another problem we talked about before was with vets, and it's really key now when we talk about Brexit, these custom checks at the borders. I talked about, under the third country status, products moving between the UK and the EU have to have animal health certificates, sanitary and phytosanitary checks. These are carried out by your vets as well. So you need people, we need a lot more people trained up to do these. And often the people that are doing these sort of official veterinarians are the term for this. A lot of people doing this are coming from Europe who are filling these roles. And there's a real issue in our hands here. Who's going to fill this? And obviously you think about vets, it take 5 years to train vets too. So it's not something we can just sort overnight. But in the last 2 weeks, Scotland's rural universities and colleges has just announced that there's going to be the first new Scottish vet school in 150 years. So that's going to be established in Aberdeen. There's currently one in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And that is really, it's not just going to talk about increasing the number of places for vets, it's also going to look at things like your animal health and your food standards and training people up with skills within these areas too. And it's also going to gear towards those who maybe don't get the qualifications for vet medicine as well. So hopefully this will not be an immediate solve to the problem, but it's something longer term, because these problems are here to stay. So hopefully longer term there will be things in place to sort some of these challenges.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah, because it does seem so crazy, these courses where you need all A's, to get into. It's just absolutely crazy. Like,
it's difficult. I mean, I remember a vet student once wrote to me, and she was telling me, not a vet student, she'd wanted to be a vet student, and she hadn't quite got her grade, very close, but not quite. I think it was her maths she hadn't got, and she was telling me all the experience she's done, the background, the work she'd put into it, and because of her grades, and in terms of everything else that made her as a person so capable to be a vet, they're just so strict on this. I do think that it's really outdated, that what goes into veterinary practice. I think there's a real need to sort of adjust and take a hard look at who we're accepting into vet school.
Yeah, good, and widen it. Yeah, good. Oh well, and so I think you said the Royal Highland show has started this week. Is there differences with COVID, and
yes,
what can you tell us?
So today marks the opening day of the Royal Highland Show Showcase. So it's very much a virtual offering, and the traditional Royal Highland Show event, this would be the second year the physical event has been cancelled. But so this year, Fergus Ewing, before he stood down, one of his sort of last acts as cabinet secretary, is he announced 750 million that would go towards RAS, who are the official body who operate the Royal Highland Show, and this has been to provide this incredible global showcase of farming, and it's going to be exhibitor led only, so only exhibitors can actually be on the show field at Ingliston, and it's taking place from today, so starting on the Monday until Sunday, and you'll have everything from your usual things for your displays of your dairy and your beef and your sheep. You've got your sheep shearing displays, you've got cooking demonstrations and different workshops and talks, and it's really hoping this is something that people will sort of be able to tune into from all over the world, and it's very high quality, that the digital platform that they're using. I think today, I think within the first couple of hours this morning, there was 10,000 people logged on to watch it, and I was watching. My family would normally be there with our belted Galloway Castle, and we weren't showing this year, but I was watching some of the classes just from my office right here. So it is great, but with the Royal Highland Show, the really sad thing about it is it's not just an opportunity for farmers to get together and show their livestock. It's also an amazing shop front for the public to come and to see what farmers do, what they're producing, to actually get to know their food producers. And it's really, it would have been so fantastic to have had that this year, especially off the back of the pandemic, where people are so interested in where their food comes from. There's been a real drive towards supporting local food production. It would have been great to sort of see that manifested in the Highland Show, but unfortunately it's not the case. But they're very much looking forward to having a fantastic event next year. And often the Highland Show, over the 4 days, they welcome around 200,000 visitors. A lot of that are your school visits and your children too. So but what has been happening instead is, like, throughout the year, although the sort of farming calendar of events has closed, you haven't had the same sort of interactions and public meetings. Even your sales and your shows haven't been the same. What they have done has been a real explosion online and farm tours, and there's a digital platform called Go Rural, and they're the sort of front-facing sort of Scottish agri-tourism website, and they really promote farms that have diversified into leisure and tourism. And what they've been doing is they've been airing what's called Lambethon. So people have been, across April time, they've been of lambing, and they've been tuning in every day. They've been on a different farm, and they've been able to follow lambing happening live, like a sort of lambing live Kate Humble situation. And it's been wonderful because people are they're not able to get onto farms, but they're still able to engage and keep up those important conversations. So that's been wonderful. And there's been things like Farmer Time. It's something I've been following a bit as well. So schools have been linked up with a farmer, and they're able to, once a week, once every 2 weeks, phone up for a Zoom call, and the farmer will take the phone around the farm, and the kids will interact and ask questions. And again, just keeping up those really vital conversations until we can actually get out and meet people again, which is just hugely important.
That sounds brilliant, yeah. And you'd mentioned last time was it the Royal Highland Education Trust? So are they involved in that as well? Or?
Yeah, so the last year for the Royal Highland Education Trust, it's been really difficult because what they tend to do is they go with their network of volunteers across Scotland. They're going into schools and they're meeting with primary pupils and talking about food production. And I'm a volunteer that does that too in the Clyde region. And then at the same time, they also take schools out onto farms and they meet the farmers themselves. So we've not been able to do that this year, which has been very disappointing. But Rhett's still been working in the background to open up again. They've been developing online resources for teachers as well that they can download and share with their pupils. And I'm actually doing my first in-person Rhett talk this Friday. I'm at a school in Glasgow. I think I'm one of the first volunteers to do one. I think mine's a bit of a trial to see how it goes out with the classroom. I think I'm doing it I'm doing it in the playground with primary 2 pupils, which will be just wonderful. I'm just so excited to actually be out and meet with young pupils again and talk about farming. So I think they're very excited to be back on the road with that soon.
Yeah, oh, that's good. Brilliant. Good. So I think Jenny has got a question.
Yeah, so there's one question here. So farmers are one of the unrecognised key workers, but how has the mix of COVID and Brexit been for their mental health? Are they struggling?
you know, the last year it's been very difficult, and although farming is one of the sectors that's been relatively unaffected in terms of, you know, they're out in green spaces, you know, they're still working, they're still producing food, you know, it's just been the sort of isolation that comes with farming has been really sort of compounded by this. You know, there's a lot of farmers who, we talked about lambing earlier. You know, your lambing is a really intensive, difficult and emotional time for farmers. But normally it's okay because they'll have a break. There'll be a social break in the calendar. They'll meet with their friends and family across the country at shows and sales. But it's just not happened that way. You know, lambing's ran into calving, that's ran into harvest, that's ran into, you know, a cold winter, and nobody's had any breaks or time to check in on one another. And often with farming, you know, they're not working a sort of 9 to 5 job. They're working 7 days a week. It's relentless. And especially over the last year, there's been more pressures on farmers with, you know, COVID restrictions and dealing with so many changes, like a lot of farmers that would have been supplying produce to the hospitality sector, retail sector, they've gone defunct. They've suddenly had to change everything to online as well. So that's had a real impact on the pressures facing farmers. And already mental health is one of the biggest challenges in farming. You know, recently there was a survey done, and it was actually found that a lot of farmers say it's the biggest challenge facing farm. One of the sort of biggest hidden dangers in farming is poor mental health. And sadly, the statistic still stands that one farmer a week takes their own life to suicide every year. And it's very difficult within farming to sort of really get to the root of this problem. There's going to be a mental health film that's launched this coming Wednesday, and it's actually going to be looking at some of the key concerns within farming and some of the practical solutions too. There's a fantastic farming charity, RSABI, and I speak to them on a regular basis. And over the last year, I mean, they've been providing they provide holistic support for farmers who are struggling. It might not just be mental health, it could be financial difficulties or other things too. But over the last year, I mean, they've got a helpline that has just absolutely soared for the roof. I think they've helped over 700 farming families in the last year, and this is regular support where they're checking in as well. And it's fantastic. There's a service out there that speaks the language of farming. You can really give that sort of tiered support. But it has just been, I think, not having these social breaks, it's just been really devastating. And I think the industry is just desperate to meet each other again and to check on one another. And there was a campaign launched last year, the Keep Talking campaign. It was by this farming charity, RSABI. And the whole idea behind it was, you know, we might not be meeting, but we've got to keep talking. We've got to, you know, check in on your neighbours, check in on people you haven't seen for a while. And like, we had a whole farming community that, you know, really sort of embraced this campaign and really checked in on one another, which was wonderful. And actually this January I took part in a challenge for the same charity called Run 1000, and I have ran quite a lot in the past, but I am by no means am I a middle distance runner. But they basically recruited lots of people across agriculture, across the country, to really get out there and it was to run 1,000 miles. It ended up running way more than 1,000 miles, but it was to give people a sort of common goal to check in with one another during a really difficult time in the month. January is a very difficult time for anybody, and it was to get people doing exercise and to also raise funds at the same time. And actually there was, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people that took part in this across the country and shared it on social media. So there have been sort of challenges and campaigns across the country throughout the last year that have been really focused on supporting mental health and farming.
Thank you. So yeah, that sounds interesting. We can maybe share some of those different websites that you mentioned and things.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's a good idea, having a sort of circle of people like checking in on each other like that. Yeah. So just a sort of final thing we maybe touch on, since Glasgow's hopefully got the COP26 conference coming up, and I think you've been talking, doing some talks about maybe different approaches that farming can do. I mean, I always thought like the most environmentally friendly was plant-based sort of production, but I think you maybe have some different ideas on that. Tell us more about that.
The farming journalist would have different ideas, but so over the last year, I've done actually a couple of talks, often, farming is sort of pitted against veganism, which is something I do struggle with as a concept, because obviously a lot of farmers are producing vegetables, so but they do tend to sort of put us in these sort of two camps. But I think that's something I've touched on before. If we look at the sort of land profile in Scotland, 85% of our land is deemed less favourable area. So it's poor quality land, which can really be used for not much else than grazing livestock, but it's fantastic grass that can be converted into protein, and that's why we can really produce great food, great protein in Scotland, where only 15% can really be put towards arable production. So really a move towards a more plant-based diet, which is local in Scotland, is going to be very difficult, which is why we would really look to be importing a lot more plant-based foods. And that's something that I'm always, I like to point out if we talk about it, is there's huge sort of demands for almonds and avocados, and these are obviously being imported from many, many miles away in South America and the likes, and the sort of carbon footprint attached to that, and also the sort of water intense practices that are used to produce these. For example, like your almonds, it's hugely water intensive process. So I think if you look at other plant-based alternatives, like a milk alternative, which is with oats, we produce lots of oats in Scotland, and it's something we're really looking to change is in terms of our oat production and how that can maybe used for a milk alternative as well. But for me, like, the point I always try to make is, demand for meat isn't going anywhere. I think people are recognising sort of more flexitarian diets. They're increasing their vegetable intake. They're reducing their meat slightly, hopefully towards better quality local meat. That's what I'm always pushing for. But I think is what we don't want to be doing is stopping livestock production in this country, because you would just be creating a gap to be filled by imported foods, and you don't have any say over how that food is produced. And we've talked before about the US model, and in terms of the way animals can be transported across the country, and they don't have the same regulations in transit that we have. There's not the same transparency in what you're eating as customers. And I think it's really important to be, looking sustainably and locally in terms of the food that we're producing. And I think in Scotland, we've got incredibly high welfare practices, and the way the food that we produce is something we can always be improving. And I think that's something the recent bill that's going through the UK that's talking about improving animal welfare is something we constantly need to be looking at doing, and also doing it in a way that is environmentally friendly. Because at the end of the day, cattle livestock, they produce greenhouse gas emissions. We know, we contribute to 5%, and it's something we want to keep lowering. I think we've reduced by 30% our emissions or something in the last few years, because we've been streamlining and improving our production practices as well. So I think sort of moving forward, I think we could be looking to be just making more responsible food choices. And that comes back to my point earlier about seasonality. Looking what's in season, what can we be supporting locally that's in season, so we're making sure that we're increasing our self-sufficiency. We're only 60% self-sufficient in Scotland. This isn't good enough. This could be much higher. I know obviously we're always going to have to import some of our fruits, like bananas. We're never going to produce bananas in this climate, but we're looking at things like vertical farming. Soon in the future we'll be able to produce some things we could never produce here, because it's in a chamber where you can create the environment to produce that food. So I think there's other things that we're looking at, but ultimately we need to start really raising domestic production here. And whether you're vegan or you're a meat eater, there's always sustainable choices available here. Just we need to, as consumers, we need to do the research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm guessing almond trees don't grow in our temperatures, because we've certainly got enough water here.
We've got, this is something I've been asked that before, but no. Can
we make a fortune doing that? No. Oh, well, thank you very much, Claire. It's been really interesting talking about all those things this evening. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.